Hi, I'm Tucson Morrison with Onsite Public Media, and we are conducting an interview today with Minneapolis Public School Board candidate Michael Dueñes, and today is Friday, July 31st, 2020, which is important to note. So, Michael, can you quick tell us who you are and why you're running, and then we'll get into more details later.
Well, one of the reasons I'm running, I'll start with that, is because a lot of people in the community, after listening to me and my work against the CDD.
What's the CDD?
So the Comprehensive District Design, and that's it's a massive district-wide redesign that's going to shuffle students quite a bit around the entire district. The reasons it was given for being pushed forward is it would help with the budget and it would help on equity issues.
Okay.
And it doesn't get to that, but I'll talk about that later.
We'll definitely get to the CDD more.
And so when I was doing that work, I had a lot of people, several organizations approach me about running for the at-large school seat because I have a policy background, used to be a senior policy analyst on racial disparity issues and criminal justice, as well as other issues. And I've been a professor at the University of Minnesota and in the community college system. So I'm used to talking, I'm used to explaining complex ideas and trying to simplify them.
What did you teach at Minnesota?
So at Minnesota I taught Chicano studies, that was my area, and leadership studies, but primarily Chicano studies. And at the community college system, I taught political science courses. Okay.
So you taught at the U, you're used to speaking, dealing with policy. A few people reached out to you and said you should run for the at-large seat. I want to go into, how have you lived in Minnesota all your life, or what is your relationship with Minnesota, and how did you come to this point of, teaching at the U and all this other stuff?
Yeah. So my background is I'm a third-generation Mexican American. My family, my dad's side is born in southern Minnesota, came up with the migrant farm stream. My mom's side came up with the railroad and settled in Minneapolis. I was born in southern Minnesota, lived down there farming. My dad was a sharecropper in southern Minnesota. He eventually made enough money to buy his own farm, and we farmed, eventually moved to Florida. And then in Florida, we went bankrupt during the farm crisis of the 1980s. We moved back to Minnesota, but we didn't have enough money to move back where our family was. And so I was lucky because the county government gave me a work permit to work full-time. I was 15 at the time, I was underage, but because there were so many farm children who needed to work full-time, that county office was altering our birth year. And so I was able to work full-time when I was 15 in construction with my dad. And we saved up enough money with my dad and mom working and me, and we moved back to Minnesota. I went to St. Paul High School, graduated from St. Paul High School in my last 2 years. Went on to McAllister College, got a really nice scholarship there, and then couldn't find work after college. It was during the big recession, and so I started working construction again. I was a union construction worker, like my dad, and then I eventually said I needed to take a break. I got injured, and I left to Mexico to go learn my language better, Spanish, and was there for several months, and then came back. Applied to graduate school in political science. I got my PhD and one of the few Latino political scientists in the country. And then I moved back to Minneapolis and started working at the College of St. Catherine, it was called then. And I started a diversity office there for the college. And in addition to that, I grew that, and then I became involved in, because of my background, political science and public policy. A former mentor recruited me to be the senior policy analyst for a statewide legislative process on defining and addressing the racial disparity gap in our criminal justice system. And
I'm
so
sure that was no small task.
It was no small task. We had, my boss had cops tailing him every day to work and escorting him home to make sure he was safe. That would occasionally happen to me. But what was really important about that is he was a public health expert. And he brought with him a really big desire about how do we build a grassroots statewide research project? How do we bring people who have been silent and talking about how they've been racially profiled or how they've been mistreated in our criminal justice system? How do we go and talk to average people? How do we talk to the people who are actually in jail or have been through the judicial process? And so we set up these small community we went to small community organizations. We went to neighborhood leaders, the women, the grandmas, the aunties who the kids would go to after school to get something to eat, to have a safe place to play. And it was really eye-opening, because that was my whole purpose in life, was how do I give voice to people who are voiceless? How do I help empower those who are disempowered or marginalized by political and social and economic systems? So I have a really big passion for that. I worked on that. We identified Minnesota had the worst racial disparity in criminal justice in the country, no matter how you looked at it.
No matter how you try to
no matter how you sliced or diced it.
And it's interesting you say that, because being a person of color in Minnesota, there's always this, for me, from my personal experience, there's always been this spin on it, you know, and you can see people try to shape or form it and say, you know what, we're working on it, or you know what, we're taking intermediate steps to figure this out. And then there comes a certain point where Minnesota it keeps ranking at the top in the country, and it's like, well, where's the work? It gets kind of mind-boggling where, all right, so we're like number one-ish in the country in racial disparity in education. This is like several years in a row what's happening. So I hear what you're saying, and it does become frustrating looking in from the outside, or being a part of it, I guess.
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons I started getting more involved in K-12 education. I've always been involved in higher education and making it more accessible for people of color and those who are marginalized. But I've always, because of that, had to work a lot with high school and middle school students and teachers and social workers. And I always had one foot in that. And now that my son, he's been in Minneapolis Public School since kindergarten, he's going to South High School next year, he's just graduated from Seward Montessori. There's a lot of talk about, well, that we have this racial disparity, and what's been lost in the conversation is when I moved to Minnesota in the mid-'80s, we were the best state in the country for educating Latino students in K-12. The highest ranked, nationally recognized for that. Very few people know that, and today we're the worst.
Wow.
So
what happened?
Part of it is the racial disparities that we know about in criminal justice and law enforcement. We also know in other public health areas started to happen in K-12 education. As white students were receiving a stronger education and improving, the education of people of color and indigenous people in the state started sliding. And no one was noticing. They were choosing to focus on white students excelling and students of color not excelling with them. And then students of color started sliding backwards. And it's really frustrating as someone who works in education. It's really frustrating that the voice of the students in the 90s were saying, I feel like I'm being pushed out of school. I have a friend, I have a cousin. This has happened to them by teachers or by principals, or they keep getting shuffled around, and no one was listening to them. And the students had the front seat about what was going on. And what they were talking about was mirroring the experience of my parents. My uncle dropped out of high school because the teacher called him the equivalent of the N-word for a Mexican.
Called him a derogatory term. We could just
very derogatory term. He stood up and he threw the teacher against the chalkboard, and he said, "Don't ever call me that again." And he walked out of school, but he never went back. And that's a really common experience for a lot of people.
And I think for Minnesota, it may not be as overt as a derogatory term, but the question is, and you said we have these students that are sliding back, and I would want to challenge you and say, could you use language in saying that they're pushed back?
And that's from the kind of, it's like the difference between the achievement gap and saying it's the student's fault or the family's fault for not performing, as opposed to the opportunity gap, which is, well, what are the support structures for these students?
Exactly.
And when I came here, best education for Latino students in the country, one of the best for African American students, extensive ESL programs for Hmong students and new immigrants and refugees.
I went to Wyndham when they took the open program from Jefferson and then put it to Wyndham, and you couldn't, like, it was a machine. Like, it was English all the time. They would run ESL, like, you know, just in the door, like night and day, like just from the beginning to the end.
And what was also present we had a lot of counselors in the building.
Yeah.
It's no longer like today with so few counselors.
Yeah.
Back then, we had so many counselors available to us, and they couldn't do everything, and there weren't enough, but there were enough to really make a difference in the quality of education and supporting students.
Yeah. I didn't even know, when I went to South, I didn't know that we had counselors until the teacher brought it up to me. I was having a real tough time my sophomore year, and he was like, you know what, you should go talk to so-and-so down at the counselor's office. And I was like, I don't want to go to the principal's office. I don't need to be, punished or directed. He's like, no, it's a counselor, like they talk to you. And I went and talked to this counselor, and to this day, I still talk to the counselor. Like they reached out to me on Facebook, but that bond was so profoundly priceless. Like that helped me through the entirety of my sophomore year, going into junior year. Like I don't know what I would have done without having that counselor at my high school. It was profoundly impactful in a way that I could have never imagined.
Yeah, and that's really what good support staff does.
Yeah,
right. They can find a way to engage students, give another reason for a student to want to go to school.
Yeah.
And to do better in school, and having that adult that someone can trust is really sliding backwards. I mean, all the statistics today are showing that most students in high school and middle school do not have an adult they trust enough to talk to.
Wow.
In the building.
Yeah.
And it's a huge shift. It's been trending that way for a while, and part of when we look at education and really beginning to address the opportunity gap and helping BIPOC students perform better, do better in school, it's how teachers teach and what they're teaching. That's part of it, but the other part is really helping students get engaged, and that's what your support staff does. They help students get engaged. They help teachers work with students so that the teachers can focus on teaching. Mm-hmm. And they bring a lot to the educational mission of a school. And when we look at the opportunity gap and ways to begin to address it, and this was one of the reasons I spoke against the CDD, is it was supposed to address this equity, this opportunity gap, but there is no additional funding for staff, for training of staff. It was loosely put out there to hire more teachers of color, but no school in the state of Minnesota has been successful with that in a significant way, despite a lot of money being invested at the state and local level. So it's like, well, what can we do to help students and support students in their educational mission and in their goal? Because most students don't go to school saying, I'm going to drop out or I'm going to do bad. It's like, no, you think back to the kids in kindergarten, in first grade, that they want to be there.
Yeah.
They want to learn.
Yeah.
They want to engage with the teacher. They want to engage with their classmates.
Yeah. And they want community. I mean, I think, and that, I can't speak for every student, but I would assume people want community, or they want to go to a place that is not endangering their spirit, not endangering them physically, mentally, and I think a big thing that we miss sometimes is it endangers their narrative. And I think a lot of kids of color show up to school and they get told who they are, what they need to do, and then what success or what failure looks like. And when you have these repeated pictures and narratives, and not to the complete onus on the teachers, but to the system that isn't supporting teachers to support the kids, you're walking into these situations where you have the nation's leading racial disparity in education. And I can't imagine what that does to the mentality, the physical aspect of it, and the spirit of students walking into a school and the school's failing them, and I can't imagine what that must feel like. And I do know what it feels like, because I went to at a few, the schools I went to growing up definitely had a fair amount of racial disparity going on. But